The car pulled up outside the club at exactly midnight, and Louis Armstrong knew immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. Three men in expensive suits stepped out, their faces hard and expressionless in the way that only men accustomed to violence could manage. They walked past the line of people waiting to enter, past the doorman who suddenly found somewhere else to look, and directly toward the bandstand where Louis was playing. The music died mid-phrase as every musician on stage recognized what was happening. In 1920s Chicago, when men like these came for you, there were only two possible outcomes. You went with them or you died right there. Louis carefully set down his trumpet, his hands steady despite the fear flooding his system, and nodded to the men. "Mr. Capone would like a word," the largest of them said, his voice quiet and polite in a way that made the threat even more explicit. Louis had known this night was coming. He'd been trying to avoid it for months, playing a dangerous game of balancing between rival gangsters who controlled every club, every venue, every opportunity to work in Chicago. But the game had rules, and Louis had just broken the most important one. You couldn't be in two places at once, and when Al Capone expected you at his club, you'd better be there. Chicago in 1925 was a city running on illegal liquor, organized crime, and the kind of violence that made the newspapers every morning. Prohibition had turned alcohol into black market gold, and the men who controlled that market became more powerful than the politicians who were supposed to stop them. Al Capone ran the South Side with an iron fist, his organization controlling speakeasies, brothels, gambling operations, and the police who were supposed to shut them down. His rival, Hymie Weiss, controlled the North Side with equal ruthlessness. And caught between these two empires were thousands of people just trying to survive, trying to make a living, trying not to become collateral damage in a war fought over territory and profit. Louis Armstrong was 24 years old, newly arrived from New Orleans, and already recognized as one of the most talented trumpet players in the city. But talent didn't pay rent, talent didn't put food on the table. What paid in Chicago was playing in the clubs, and the clubs were all owned by gangsters. You didn't get to choose who you worked for based on moral considerations. You worked for whoever would hire you, and you were grateful for the opportunity. Louis had started playing at the Sunset Cafe, one of Capone's establishments, and the money was better than anything he'd made in New Orleans. Capone liked jazz, appreciated good musicianship, and paid his performers well as long as they followed the rules. The rules were simple. You showed up on time, you played your best, you didn't talk to the police, and most importantly, you were loyal. Loyalty in Capone's world wasn't abstract. It meant you didn't work for his enemies, you didn't play at their clubs, you didn't take their money. Because if you did, you were choosing sides in a war, and the penalty for choosing the wrong side was death. Louis understood these rules. He'd seen what happened to people who broke them, bodies found in alleys, musicians who disappeared and were never heard from again. The violence was casual, constant, and completely accepted as the cost of doing business in Chicago. But then Hymie Weiss had made Louis an offer, twice the money Capone was paying, better working conditions, a featured spot instead of playing in an ensemble. It was exactly the kind of opportunity a young musician dreams about, the chance to be recognized, to make a name, to earn enough money to maybe, someday, escape the gangster-controlled club circuit entirely. But accepting Weiss's offer meant betraying Capone, and betraying Capone meant death. So Louis tried something clever, something he would later recognize as either brilliant or suicidally stupid depending on how the story ended. He said yes to both of them. The plan was simple: play at Capone's Sunset Cafe most nights, but on the nights when Capone wasn't there, when he was out of town or focused on other business, slip away and play at Weiss's club on the North Side, collect money from both, build relationships with both, stay valuable enough to both that neither would want to kill him. It was a high-wire act, constantly balancing, always one mistake away from falling, but for several months it worked. Louis would play at the Sunset Cafe until closing, then rush across town to play a late set at Weiss's place. He'd pocket double wages and congratulate himself on being smarter than the system. What Louis didn't fully understand was that in Chicago's underworld there were no secrets. Capone had eyes everywhere, informants in every club, spies in every organization, people who would sell information for a few dollars or out of fear of what would happen if they didn't. It was only a matter of time before Capone learned that his trumpet player, the kid from New Orleans he'd been paying and protecting, was also taking money from his most dangerous rival. And when Capone learned something like that, the response was predictable and brutal. The The mistake that ended Louis' balancing act was a scheduling conflict. Both Capone and Weiss wanted him playing on the same night at the same time. Louis tried to explain to Weiss that he had a prior commitment, that he couldn't make it that night, but Weiss made it clear that this wasn't a request. An important business associate was visiting, and Weiss wanted his best musicians performing. Refusing wasn't an option, so Louis made a choice that he would spend the rest of his life analyzing. He played for Weiss, hoping that Capone wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, would be focused on other matters. Capone noticed. Capone always noticed. And at midnight, while Louis was playing a trumpet solo to thunderous applause at Weiss's club, 3 of Capone's men walked in and everything stopped. The club went silent. People who had been drinking and dancing suddenly found excuses to leave. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone recognized the uniforms of Capone's organization, the hard faces of men who killed for a living. And everyone knew that the trumpet player who had been stupid enough to play both sides was about to receive a very permanent lesson in loyalty. Louis went with them because there was no alternative. He didn't ask where they were taking him, didn't plead or make excuses, didn't try to run. Running would just mean dying tired. Instead, he climbed into the car, sat between 2 of Capone's men who hadn't said a word since identifying themselves, and tried to think. There had to be a way out of this, some explanation that would satisfy Capone, some gesture that would spare his life. But Louis knew the gangster world well enough to understand that explanations rarely mattered. Capone wouldn't care why Louis had betrayed him. The only thing that mattered was that he had. The car drove to the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, Capone's headquarters, a fortified building that served as both office and fortress. Louis was escorted through the lobby past guards who watched him with the casual interest of people who'd seen this scene play out dozens of times before. They took him to a back room where Capone himself was waiting, sitting behind a desk, smoking a cigar, his face showing no emotion at all. That was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. Anger could be managed, redirected, cooled down. This cold calculation was harder to escape. "You know why you're here," Capone said. "Not a question, but a statement." Louis nodded. "There was no point in lying. I pay you good money, I give you steady work, I protect you, and you take money from Hymie Weiss." Capone's voice was quiet, almost conversational, which made the threat more explicit. Loud anger would have been easier to handle. This quiet disappointment suggested a decision had already been made. "Mr. Capone, I can explain," Louis started, but Capone raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't want explanations. I want you to understand something. In this business, loyalty is everything. You can't be loyal to me and Hymie Weiss both. You have to choose, and since you didn't choose me, I have to assume you chose him." The implication was clear. People who chose Weiss over Capone didn't live long enough to regret it. But then Capone did something unexpected. He stood up, walked around the desk, and looked at Louis with what might have been curiosity. "I hear you're good, really good. That's the only reason you're still breathing. Hymie said you were the best trumpet player in Chicago, and I don't like admitting Hymie's right about anything. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to play for me, right now, just you and that trumpet. And if you're as good as everyone says, maybe we can find a way through this that doesn't end with you in a ditch." Louis understood what was happening. This was a test, but not the kind you could study for. Capone was giving him a chance to prove his value, to demonstrate that losing him would be costly enough that mercy might be the better business decision. It was the slimmest possible lifeline, but it was something. Louis had his trumpet. With him, he'd grabbed it automatically when Capone's men came to collect him, some instinct telling him to hold on to the thing that defined him. Now that instinct might save his life. They brought in a piano player, one of Capone's regular musicians who looked terrified to be involved in whatever this was. Capone sat back down, gestured for them to begin, and lit another cigar. The room was silent except for the sound of nervous breathing. Louis lifted his trumpet, placed it against his lips, and tried to think of what to play. What do you play when your life depends on it? What song, what style, what approach could possibly convince a gangster that you're worth keeping alive? Louis decided not to overthink it. He played what he felt, what came naturally, what had always worked when the stakes were highest. He played the blues, that new Orleans sound that carried all the pain and joy and survival of his people, the music that communicated more than words ever could. The first notes were tentative, testing, but then Louis found his rhythm, found the emotion underneath the fear, and the music took over. He played a solo that started soft and melancholy, built to something powerful and defiant, then resolved into something almost hopeful. It was 3 minutes of pure feeling compressed into melody and rhythm and technique. When he finished, the silence in the room was complete. Capone sat motionless, the cigar burning forgotten in his hand. The other men looked uncertain, unable to read their boss's reaction. Louis stood still, trumpet lowered, waiting for judgment. This was the moment when he would either live or die, and it was completely out of his control. Capone broke the silence with something Louis hadn't expected. He laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine pleasure. Hymie was right, Capone said, shaking his head. You're something special. He stood up again, approached Louis, and put a heavy hand on his shoulder. Louis forced himself not to flinch. Here's the new deal, Capone said. You work for me, only me. You don't go near Weiss's clubs. You don't take his money. You don't even look at his people funny. You show up at the Sunset Cafe every night I tell you to, and you play like you just played now. You do that and you'll make more money than Weiss ever offered you. You'll be protected. Nobody in this city will touch you because you'll be under my protection. But if you ever betray me again, there won't be a second chance. You understand? Louis understood. He was being given his life back, but with conditions that would govern his every move. He would be Capone's musician, part of the organization, implicitly endorsing everything Capone did even if he never pulled a trigger himself. It was a deal with the devil, but the alternative was immediate death. I understand, Mr. Capone, Louis said, his voice steady despite everything. You won't regret this. Capone smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Make sure I don't. Now get out of here. You've got a show at the Sunset Cafe tomorrow night, and I better see you there. Louis nodded, turned to leave, then stopped. Mr. Capone, thank you. Capone waved the thanks away. Don't thank me. Thank your trumpet. That's the only reason you're walking out of here. The car ride back to his apartment was silent. Louis sat alone in the back seat, holding his trumpet, trying to process what had just happened. He'd survived. Against impossible odds, against every expectation, he'd walked into Al Capone's headquarters and walked out alive. The music had saved him, just like it had saved him from poverty, from obscurity, from every other threat he'd faced in his young life, but the cost was his freedom. He was now Capone's property, bound to a gangster who killed without hesitation, forced to be complicit in an organization built on violence and illegal activity. For the next several years, Louis would play at the Sunset Cafe and other Capone-controlled venues. He would become one of the most popular performers in Chicago, his reputation growing with every performance. The money was good, the exposure was invaluable, and his talent found an audience that would eventually make him famous worldwide, but always in the background was the knowledge that his success was tied to Al Capone, that the man who protected him was also the man who could destroy him with a word. The story of that night at the Hawthorne Hotel became legend among Chicago musicians. The night Louis Armstrong played for his life and won. The night Al Capone, one of the most dangerous men in America, was moved by music to show mercy instead of violence. It was the kind of story that made Louis seem larger than life, a man who could charm even gangsters, who could turn enemies into protectors through the sheer power of his artistry. But Louis himself always told the story differently. When people would romanticize it, talk about music conquering violence or art triumphing over evil, Louis would shake his head. I got lucky, he'd say. Capone was in a good mood. If he'd been in a bad mood, I'd be dead and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Don't make it more than it was. I was a kid who made a stupid mistake and happened to survive it. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Yes, Louis got lucky. Yes, circumstances could have been different and the outcome fatal. But it was also true that his talent saved him. That the music he played in that room communicated something that words couldn't, that touched something in Capone that rational argument never would have reached. Whether you call that skill or luck or divine intervention depends on your perspective. But the fact remains that Louis Armstrong walked into a room expecting to die and walked out with a job instead. The relationship between Louis and Capone would continue for years, a strange partnership between artist and criminal that benefited both. Capone got the best jazz musician in Chicago playing at his clubs, drawing crowds, adding legitimacy to his establishments. Louis got protection, money, and a platform that would eventually launch him to international fame. Neither was using the other exactly. It was more like a transaction between two people who understood that survival sometimes required compromise, that the world wasn't divided into pure good and evil, but existed in shades of gray where most people lived. When Capone was finally arrested and sent to prison in 1931, Louis's connection to the gangster world loosened. He moved to New York, then eventually to a career that took him around the world, but he never forgot the lessons of Chicago. That talent alone wasn't enough to survive, that you needed to be smart, to read situations, to know when to fight and when to accommodate, that sometimes the people who seemed most dangerous could also be your unexpected saviors. In later interviews, when asked about his time in Chicago, Louis would sometimes mention Capone, not fondly exactly, but with a kind of pragmatic acceptance. He was a gangster, Louis would say. Everyone knew what he was, but he loved music, he paid on time, and he kept his word. I've worked for plenty of legitimate businessmen who couldn't say the same. It was Louis's way of acknowledging the complexity of his past without either condemning or endorsing it. He'd survived a dangerous time by being talented and lucky in equal measure, and he wasn't going to pretend it was more noble or more shameful than it actually was. The night Al Capone wanted him dead became one of many stories in Louis Armstrong's long and complicated life. The defining moment of his career wasn't the thing that made him important or great, but it was a reminder that the path to greatness is rarely straightforward or pure, that sometimes success requires navigating morally ambiguous situations, making compromises that are necessary for survival, existing in spaces where the rules are violent and arbitrary, and the only thing that matters is staying alive long enough to play another day. Louis Armstrong became one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. His innovations in jazz, his distinctive voice, his charismatic performances, all of that would have happened regardless of his connection to Al Capone. But the skills he learned in Chicago, reading situations, managing danger, using his talent strategically, those served him well throughout his life. He learned that music could be more than entertainment. It could be power, protection, a kind of currency that worked in situations where money or words failed. Did music really save Louis Armstrong that night? Or did Capone's mood, his business calculations, his appreciation for rare talent do the saving? The answer is probably all of those things mixed together. What's certain is that a 24-year-old trumpet player walked into Al Capone's headquarters expecting to die and walked out with his life and a contract. That the music he played in that room, under maximum pressure with his life in the balance, was good enough to change a gangster's mind, and that the legend of that night would follow Louis for the rest of his life, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous situations produce the most extraordinary performances. The night Al Capone wanted him dead, but Louis Armstrong played his trumpet, and the music was enough to turn wanting into sparing, death into opportunity, the end into a new beginning. That's the power of art in the hands of someone who knows how to use it, not as escape from reality, but as a tool for navigating reality, for turning even the most hostile situations into survivable ones. Louis learned that lesson well. And he carried it with him from Chicago's gangster-controlled clubs to the world's greatest stages, from the edge of death to the pinnacle of achievement. All because one night, when everything was on the line, his trumpet spoke louder than violence and fear. And for once, in a world governed by guns and money, music won.